Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone. Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I'm Emily Carrington, EPLA's Executive Director.
And I'm Maria Servold, EPLA's President. And today we're going to talk about some ways and a little bit of our own stories about how to talk about miscarriage with children.
Yeah, this is something, in both of our own stories, we didn't have children yet, but it came up later because it's not something that goes away. And then obviously, many mothers who miscarry are also coming home to children of all ages and any age, given the frequency of miscarriage. So, Maria, how has it come up in your home, and sort of what ages, and how do you talk about it now?
Yeah, I think it came up only within the last year or two, and it was because of this organization. So, like when I would explain I was going, because if I say I'm going to work, I'm not really. So it's like I'm going to help with this group. What does it do? Well, we give things to women who had babies in their tummies, but then the babies died. And then I think my oldest asked if that had happened to me, and I said it had before she was born. So then we talked about it a little bit. She asked questions like, was it a boy or girl? All these sort of, which I didn't know, it was too early and all these things. And it's interesting because, and this is how kids are. She sort of often will talk about, we might have had a brother, because I have all girls. We might have had a brother that first baby. And it's like, how do you say, well, you might not have been here if there'd been that first, because like timing wise, it's like we don't go into that. But it's sort of fascinating. It's like she instantly, and the others too, it's like, oh, there's this other sibling out there, Yeah.
How old is your oldest?
Oldest is 8.5. Yeah. And I think whenever we've talked about it recently, she's very interested. The 6.5-year-old has some questions, and the 3-year-old is not really paying attention. But that oldest one is, curious and surprisingly not. I mean, you can tell it was sort of sad, but she just didn't fully comprehend like the physical realities of it.
I love that in children, though.
Yeah,
we told my oldest around 4, and I don't remember why, but it seemed it was just sort of, there was some occasion that sort of called for knowledge of it, and I decided it was time. And I love how, and I think we've said this before on the show, how she just accepts it. Like, we do know that at least, I told her about 1. I didn't really pile on like that there were 3. I felt like we give little information at a time, because all of mine happened before she was born. And she could have been born had any of them been born. But we do know 1 was a boy, and I have 2 girls. So she will talk about our brother, her brother. She would ask me questions like, when we get to heaven, our stroller only has 2 spots. Where will the baby go? I'm like, I don't even
practical.
know.
What a practical question.
She's a very practical child.
Yeah.
I'm like, I will have the right stroller in heaven. Yeah. I don't know. God will take care of that. But it was just so, and I remember when I learned, I was much older when I learned that my mom had miscarried, and I would not be had she not.
Same with me. There was one before me, and it was close enough that I wouldn't be here.
Yeah. So 2 of my miscarriages were close enough that they could not both coexist as babies, but my living children could with them. So I don't struggle with that as a parent, but I'm the product of that. And that never bothered me. Like, I just remember sort of delighting in that there was another one of us.
Yes.
That, and I knew that it will. I was older. I was probably in junior high, and I think I was aware that like I could not exist. The timing was sort of revealed. I don't know. Somehow I don't ever remember not knowing that. But it didn't bother me.
It didn't feel existential.
Send some existential crisis that if I wish for this life back, I'm wishing my own away. That was not, I just kind of delighted in, even as a, 12, 13-year-old, that there was more of us out there.
And I feel like I got questions like maybe, what would you have named it or something, like the things that kids ask. And that's sort of, I think, an important thing to think about with this conversation with children is to sort of let them lead with their questions, like, not throwing a bunch of information at them, but sort of seeing what they're interested in.
Right. And being clear and frank, I think, is really, really important with children. It does not, and I've realized in our own walk through any sort of suffering with our kids, that clarity has mattered, and that to not impose my adult grief and perspective on my children. I've had to work hard where things feel so heavy and so big, and and that could go both ways. We a lot of times we want to protect our kids, but when I tell my kids something sad, they have been able to process it in the way that, like, as far as their understanding. And there have been times we've had to, work through things with family therapists and counselors and work through grief and seeing, I'm not saying that they've just like marched away happily, but they've sort of surprised me.
Yeah. Well, I think that sort of makes a bigger point to not, it depends on you and the kid and your family, but you don't want to just assume across the board, like, no, my kids can't know. I can't tell them about that. It would be bad for them. Right. Like,
So one thing I remember when we talked to Nancy Kingma years ago, she came and did an educational day with us and was just fabulous. One thing I remember her saying, like, your kids know, right?
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
They don't necessarily know what happened,
but they know something happened.
Something's wrong. I mean, my kids are sharp. Now, I've got 2 little girls. They're both pretty sensitive and emotionally aware, but like, they don't miss a beat, right?
Yep. My littlest one, if I'm looking like just frustrated or confused, she looks at me and goes, "Mom, are you happy?" Right. And she always asks me that, like, when I'm irritated. So then I have to be like, yes, I'm happy.
But I'm right. So they're part of our houses, and they feel our feelings.
They're aware of what's going
on. And so I really encourage you. We're going to talk about some of the information she gave us, but I do really encourage you. There's a lot of resources out there. And we did record a whole episode with Nancy about talking to children. And there's obviously different ages of children depending on your circumstance, your house, babies, adolescents. But she even talked about, and I love this, talk to your baby, give them words. Your baby feels the existential sadness that is in your house. And even if your babies don't know, giving them the words gives them the confidence that this is something with words. I think that's important. Another thing I've read, and again, we'll couch this with, we're not the counselors, we're the moms, and we want to be here to distill and send the information to you. And there are amazing family therapists out there. And I want to say too, like, any kind of disruption and death, like, you can work with a good therapist to work through that and to build your toolbox. When my grandfather died, he was 94. There was nothing particularly tragic about it. But I watched my fresh 5-year-old work through that in some healthy and unhealthy ways. And I was thankful to have a family therapist to help us work through that as well. And even her unhealthy ways where, outbursts and seeing sort of what was normal and healthy. And I think those are good ways to, but I also watched her play through it. I watched her. So she was 4 or 5, just turned 5. And I watched her come home, and we had to replay the funeral of my grandfather's death, but it was her working through it. Right. And I thought that was so profound and aware. And again, sort of age appropriate.
Right.
One thing I read a lot of places was to be clear with your children, to not use that. If you use the language that the baby is sleeping or the baby went away, it could scare the child about sleeping.
Yes.
And going away.
Yes. Right.
That this was really clear that it's okay to use the word death. And, this is, I think, a balance as a parent, right? Like, I've on other causes of suffering in our own family, there are things that we have to be really clear with our kids about. I am very pro take your children to funerals, but I also don't think you need to make it like a weekend pastime if your children are not in relationship with that person.
Right.
But I also think that it's
not fair to them to not let them know the whole story of the person's life.
Right. So to use the word the death, or to make it clear that the baby's not going to be born.
Yes.
And that it's one thing that was also repeated a lot is that it was no one's fault. It was not mommy's fault. It was not their fault. It's nothing they thought or did or said that could cause the baby to go away.
Right.
So I think that that's, even with little young children, to take some time to figure out how you're going to say it and to say it clearly is a good place to start. There's also a lot of resources. Maria, you found a book.
Yes. So it's a picture book, which is great. And it's called Why is Mommy Crying? Explaining Early Pregnancy Loss to Young Children. And it's by a woman named Corey Ball. It's the byline on the book is I.CORIBAILL, if you want to look it up. But yeah, Why is Mommy Crying? But it's this great story about a little boy named Max who notices his mom is crying and wonders why. And so she talks about, he offers her a Band-Aid and stuff. It's very sweet. And she explains that there was a baby in mom's tummy, but there's not anymore. It's going, it died. It's going to go be in heaven. Sometimes they go back to be with God. And then he asks interesting questions like, are you leaving too? And these things. So it's really beautiful, very beautiful illustrations. And I think it very gently and yet truthfully helps explain to children. And the author, Corey, we had a great conversation, and it's back on our blog. We can link it in this podcast with some video clips. I talked to her on Zoom, and she talked about why she wrote this. And it was after her own loss. And she had, I think, one daughter already. And so it was just out of this, she wanted to be able to tell her daughter this story, was looking for resources, and there wasn't what she was looking for. So she wrote it herself.
Yeah, I love using books to talk about hard things. And this one does talk about the baby going back to God and going to heaven. And so I know for some families that's a very important part. There are other books out there that are not as religious, if that's something that you yourself are struggling with or don't believe. But I think that what's important, right, is what I like about this book too, though, is that it does fit into, it gives the family and the child, it works the child into the family's grieving and grief process, and the family's understanding of what is happening, and that your child can hold on to that.
Right. And it ends like with them, also the mom and dad and Max snuggling, and he says he's in his favorite place and it's nice and warm. So it ends really nicely. And sort of with that security that like, we're still here.
Yes.
We're still a family. It's not going to look like we thought it might, but we still love you.
Another thing I've seen for young children that's really important is maintaining that rhythm and structure, right? So even small babies, right, respond to their routines for the day, right? So maintaining that for them as much as they can, and being clear with older children if someone else is going to be picking them up from school, if there's, just sort of what to expect and that they're going to be cared for.
Right.
I think is really important. And
yeah, what else did Nancy King might have to say? Any other big tips?
Oh, yeah.
I remember being struck by the thing you said already, but I just want to hit on it again about that children will notice that something is wrong. I was, because it's like no matter how much we try to hide our adult feelings from our children, they're gonna see, that something is amiss, and you can't. Yeah.
Right. She talked to, using language agreed upon by family. So it might take some preparation. Maybe you don't have, some of this assumes that you have the time to have a family meeting about that. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have a child in the ultrasound. Sometimes you're backpedaling. I want to encourage, life and grief is messy. And it's not going to.
There's no one right way to do it.
In an imperfect situation.
Right. And I mean, yeah. So like, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast yet, but I'm expecting my fourth. Surprise. Emily knew. And we told the kids much earlier this time than like the last time. And I had this thought like, but then if something happens, I have to tell 3 sweet little girls who are already excited. But partly out of practicality that I was like, I feel sick all the time and I'm going to lay on the couch and you need to know why.
Right.
You know, but so there was that sort of like trust and hope thing that I'd be able to handle it should something happen, you know. But in the meantime, I had these little sweet children who were, you know, loving on my belly and praying for the baby, you know. It's like that's better than not.
Right. And I think as we talk about sort of bringing two things together, when you don't include your children and your children are old enough to see that if something happened, they would be very aware that there was an emergency going on.
Right.
And that's a lot of information to process at once.
Right.
So
yeah, imagine them not even knowing that there was, it's like where it's what and now it's what. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and with she breaks this down beautifully for different ages. And like I said, I really encourage you. We also have her entire talk on our Facebook page. But she, again, for almost every age, like maintaining that routine and being clear, letting them play through it and discuss their feelings, talking about death, talking about what it is and what you understand. And I think there's different ways with older children, letting them participate.
Right. Does she talk at all about, I just thought of this, giving kids the option even to come up with their own ways of remembering a lost baby? Because that might be a way that that can help them process, as if they sort of have an idea for what they'd like to do or get them involved.
Including letting them choose their level of participation, giving them a memento. That's for older, almost adolescent children. And, you know, you're going to see the grief work its way out in different ways. You know, so I encourage you to be gracious with your kids, as with anything, right? Like this is a big
change, a big moment in their lives. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's the same, you know, we just sort of compare about the conversation around what happens, you know, when grandma dies and people are there for you and that kind of thing. And, you know, so the same sort of thing, like you have to explain, well, grandma died and we're going to go to this funeral and all these things are happening. And so, you know, we should give the same dignity to a sibling that they lose.
How would you talk about another loved one? And you know, talking about the process, if mom is going to surgery and being clear and concise, and then being ready to answer questions, I think is important. Yeah. So take some time. I mean, I like even just a quick Google of how do you talk to children about this? There's a lot. Yeah, there are good resources out there. A lot of resources that are just the basic here and now resources. We've already mentioned talking to a counselor, talking to clergy, letting them know you're working through that grief too, I think is important. I read somewhere that like it is okay to cry. You know, again, it's this balance where your children are not supporting you, but they are watching you and how you're grieving. And, you know, for them to know that you're working through this as well and that you're going, and then see them at, you know, you asking for support as well. Right. I think that's something important for our kids to know in all areas of our life. You know, it's a balance, right? Like, I don't want to be like, I'm going to pile on my messiness on my child because they're not my support person. Right. But also my kid needs to know I ask for help. I meditate and pray. I work. I plan. I don't just like wake up this way. Right. Like, I think there's a tendency as moms to just sort of always be insta ready for our kids. Is that a thing? You know, or maybe I struggle with that. Like, I do all the preparation when they're sleeping or watching TV or not there. So then when they're with me, and not that they still see plenty of my mess, but I have worked in all things to include them in the preparation and participation and the work. And I think that's true in grief too. That I'm modeling that for them. They don't just get clean and squeaky me. That I'm also not their counselor. Like I can't just like close the door and I'm on for an hour. They live with me. And I think that's important. I think too, we talked a little bit, both of our situations, about after babies are born. So if they don't experience the actual loss, I love seeing children at walks of remembrance and very much involved in the ways you remember your babies.
Right. Like here are we, the rest of the family remembering together. Yeah.
Yeah. And all the other ways, our kids, I think, know that there are ornaments on the tree. And some of those things I sort of planted. I really wanted my kids to know and remember. I had dreams. Again, we've talked about this in other episodes where we would have like whole days honoring them. And that's just not the way our honoring them has worked out. But my oldest knows what I do. And she talks about it so beautifully. My husband's a professor, so he has, summers are not off, but summers are more relaxed. And I said to my daughter the other day, I've got to go to work. And she said, but it's summer. And I was like, well, your daddy still goes to work too, but things have been kind of crazy. And she's like, but it's summer. And I said, well, I don't actually.
My job doesn't stop.
I said, I work through the summer.
Yeah.
And she comes back a little later, and then I'm trying to explain. I'm distracted with trying to explain how I'm part-time but year-round, and he's full. She doesn't know any of that. Well, she doesn't care. So, and he works through the summer too. But the way we divided the schedule, I was the first Monday.
Right.
So, so she comes back to me and says, Mama, I know why you work through the summer. Babies die all year and they need your help. But she was just so like,
wow. Yeah. She
like,
understood. Yeah.
You can't take a summer off, Mama.
Right.
And I was
People
like,
need you.
People need you. And I said, you're right. You're right. I work all summer.
Yeah.
I work all year. And it was just such a sweet sort of, like, hey, I know you help babies and that's what you do. And for our family, that's how we honor our children.
Yes. Yes. And that's, to sort of bring it back to where we started. I think that was how it came up in our family, was because of I was going to go do some work for the organization. And well, what is it? Well, we do this. And then it came up. But then it was like, we're showing them how we can put that loss, not to good use, but to sort of help others going through the same thing. And I think they understand that.
Right. And I think it's, again, I mean, it comes down to clarity, presence, other things I've seen, be present.
Yeah.
This talks about, Nancy talked about too, about, talking about the person who died. I think there's just such a temptation to make it go away.
Right.
Where, and all of this is judgment, right? Like where you are as a family, what you're going through. It's so complicated, and I know some women who have suffered, tragically many miscarriages. I don't know. I don't think there's one prescription, but I do think that there are ways that we can, again, like this giving language. There was a baby in my tummy. The baby died. The baby was sick. Talking too about explaining why a little bit. You're not able to help the baby. Right. So they're not horrified the next time they get a cold. And also just being willing to open up to those questions. Yeah. And leaving room for questions. Right. And it's so hard, but it's okay to look and ask for help. If you found this podcast and you're listening, you're already doing step one, and we're going to tell you to just keep.
There's more out there.
Looking, there's so much. I think we have a
tendency to assume, especially when we're in a place of grief. No one can help me. No one knows what I'm going through, because it feels like that. But there are resources out there. There's books like we mentioned. There's just websites that list helpful things. Even in the back of this book that I mentioned, The Wise Mommy Crying, there's a whole list of resources in English and Spanish, which is awesome. Ways to help kids, including from, medical groups and that kind of thing. So it's out there. And so don't be afraid to look for it and ask for help.
Well, yeah. And realizing this is something that the whole family is going through, and that it's there. I think it's easy as a mom. I actually wanted it to be other people's loss too. I think it's easy as a mom. We talked about this a little bit in remembering. Like, will other people remember?
Yeah.
But realizing for your children, and that maybe depending on the age, maybe they had hopes and dreams and plans in the same way you sort of did, depending on if they've had a sibling before. So I think there's a lot of different ways to realize it and care for your children and to still give and make space and to help. I want to encourage moms too, to help if you are really struggling with grief and you're trying to raise children. It's okay for you to get help.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of, we've talked about this, but there's grief. You're struggling with the loss of a life, the loss of a dream. You're also struggling with some serious hormonal fluctuations likely. And so I just really encourage you, again, like I said, with leading the way, to get the help you need, and that will help you take care of your other children if that just feels too big. And it's okay to have help with caretakers.
Yes.
Yes. And to gather information.
Yep.
So
totally.
Yes. So I hope that that's a good
starting place.
A good starting place for ways to talk about it with kids. And we'd love to hear any ways you have talked about it with your children, any kind of language that has worked well, or any kind of memorial items you have used or rituals you have introduced to your family, ways that have brought you healing and peace and really sat with that grief. We would love to hear that from you. If you have any you want to share, either share in the reviews or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.